topic is preparing for the storm, lessons learned from Tropical Storm Irene on planning for resiliency and local infrastructure. There's that word resiliency that Tony Flint told us actually does resonate with the public, so we hope it resonates with you as well. I'm Heidi Ritchie with Mass Audubon, Shaping the Future of Your Community program that provides support, technical assistance, and workshops to local citizens, trying to encourage them to work with all of you in local planning and land use regulation. And we have three speakers today. Carrie Banks from the Division of Ecological Restoration, Bob Dean, who's with the Franklin County
Regional Council of Governments.
Regional Council of Governments, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
for watching that, and also Selectman in the town of Buckland, which was heavily impacted by Irene, and Patrick Garner Associates, and he's also president of the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions.
I'm Carrie Banks. I work with the Division of Ecological Restoration in the Department of Fish and Game. And I grew up along a river, and I've gotten to know it very intimately. And some of the slides that I have in here are of that river and of the area that I grew up in. And I wanted to talk today about some of the river's responses that we saw to Tropical Storm Irene. And probably many of you saw this image on the news, I think about a week before Irene hit. We knew it was tracking up the East Coast. And many communities along the eastern seaboard were getting prepared for what was coming. Many people predicted there's going to be high winds and probably a lot of tree limbs and things coming down. But I don't think we were quite prepared for all the precipitation that we saw during the storm. So this is what it looked like when it was hovering over the northeast. And is it playing on that screen? Yeah. This is what it looked like on the ground. As Bob had mentioned, you can probably see numerous videos online of all the flooding that was occurring. I particularly like this one because it speaks to a couple points that I want to make today. The rivers carry more than water. And unfortunately, sometimes that means it carries away our infrastructure. And will have consequences both at a public safety level, but also at a habitat level. So, as I mentioned, I grew up along the river. My parents still live along the Deerfield River in Charlemont, Mass. And during the day, the Tropical Storm Irene was hitting here in the northeast. I was paying very close attention to the flow gauges on the Deerfield River. There's one located at the Fifebrook Dam in Florida Row. And then there's one about 12 miles downstream of there, located just downstream of the town of Charlemont. And my parents' property is right in the middle, between those two gauges. And what's interesting is USGS just released some provisional data for that stream gauge. The stream gauge actually went underwater about 39,000 CFS. And it took them quite a while to calculate out the stream flows there, partially because Route 2 was the high water mark. And the National Guard had to come into town the day after and cleared a lot of debris that they typically use to determine high water marks. But when I saw this number, I was a bit curious. You can see that it was about 53,900 CFS, a little less than the 1938 flood, which was the peak recorded flow there. Upstream at the dam, their emergency action plan that they submitted to FERC, where they were actually getting prepared for the potential for the dam to fail, they reported that their flow was 58,329 CFS, about 4,000, 5,000 CFS difference. What's interesting about that, as I mentioned, the dam is up here on the upstream end. You follow the Deerfield River down, you can see a lot of these tributaries coming in. Pelham Brook, the Cold River, where a lot of the damage along Route 2 occurred, and you come all the way downstream to the USGS gauge. So you can imagine that those ungauged tributaries are contributing a lot of water as well. So I sat there and I thought, where did all the water go? I mean, I know USGS probably has a little bit of fudge factor in their numbers, but considering all the flow coming from these tributaries, there must have been something going on. And that's when I clicked on this slide. This is the slide that my parents took as they were evacuating their property along the Deerfield River. The house was actually in a 500-year floodplain. And what you can notice is actually a little wooden face here. A guy with like a long beard. That was the high water mark. You can also, the railing back here, when they went back, that was the high water mark. So it was even a couple feet higher than it was when they took this picture. So I think one of the lessons here was that rivers use their floodplain. Just downstream, this is overlooking the town. That's the Charlemont Elementary School. Back here in the background, you can see this is the wastewater treatment plant, the highway department, and emergency services, fire department. And you can see this whole area was inundated. You can see the deposition that occurred from the flood. And I think that one of the points I took away from this is that floodplains are important, and as much as we can, we should be protecting them from development. And we should be trying to maintain that access to the floodplain. Pat had mentioned that in a lot of, especially urbanized areas, we see what we call degradation of our streams. So basically the stream is down-cutting the channel, and there's peak flows that you're getting from the runoff. And in some of these old farm areas, you often also find old berms that have been burned up along the river, trying to prevent some of the higher flows from flooding out the crops. And these go way back. These go back to 27 flood, 38. You'll often see them right along the river corridor, and that can also be another way of cutting off access to the floodplains. Another thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned, rivers not only move water, but they're moving sediments, they're moving other debris that's in the stream. And it's a way for the river to lose its energy. Water has a lot of power. So if you think about it, as you're coming around the curve here, a lot of that energy is focused on the outside bend. So that's where we often see the erosion occurring. But it's losing energy. It's got roughness along this inside bend. And that's where we're often seeing the deposition occurring. And I think, as you're planning infrastructure again, taking a look at these areas. If we had the opportunity going back when this area was being developed for the farmland, they might have considered, where you're putting the road here in relation to how close to the outside bend it is. Just going back to my parents' property for a bit, the photo on the left there was taken a few years ago, and the photo on the right was just a couple days after the Irene. And what happened here was the channel actually realigned and adjusted and widened. And you can see again, my father got a very quick lesson in what we call fluviogeomorphology, studying how rivers change. Because he realized he lives on the outside bend. So he lost 3 to 4 acres of land during the flood. Again, this is a photo from 2005, an ortho photo. The little yellow star there is a structure that we had that sat back about 65, 75 feet from the bank. They purchased the property back in the 1970s, and prior to their purchasing, it was all farmland. And you can actually see this old river channel that cuts up here, and then if you were able to walk the property, you'd see it cut all the way back up to here. Then you might notice this white patch. That was an example of an old berm. It was basically probably dredge materials that they pulled up from the river, basically to try to prevent the river from, cutting into the area here and flooding the agricultural lands. I've seen photos from Mohawk Trail, which is right here, looking back this way, in the 1920s. So it was maybe put in during the Conservation Corps, maybe after the 1927 flood. But it's been there for quite a while. What you'll notice is something that we often see in failures, in bank failures. Just downstream of where an area has been hardened or influenced in this manner, where the bank failure occurs. And this is the area of the property, approximately the area of the property that was eroded away during the flood. Again, this is just taking a look. This is where that cobble bar was. It's now been replaced with all these fine gravels and stuff. And the whole channel, again, shifted left and actually widened quite extensively. So one of the things that we also observed, and this is just one example, of where stream channels changed and adjusted. This is just upstream of there. This is the Deerfield River flowing down this way. It actually splits around an island. And this is the Cold River coming in. Photo that I believe is about 2005. This is the photo afterwards. You can see that the river channel that used to come up to the right here actually got filled in with all this material. This is an example of aggregation where the material was deposited and adjusted the channel up and also adjusted it left. So the Cold River is now coming in a completely different location than it was previously. This is again kind of looking at that same spot. This is the Cold River. This is the tongue here is where the two channels of the Deerfield come together. This is prior to the flood. This is after the flood. So again, you can see this whole channel graded with material and the river cut left and adjusted. Another thing I think you should keep in mind is that rivers remember where they've been. And this is probably a good example. This is in the town of Conway. The town has been struggling for years now. You can see the Route 116 bridge here. Goes over the South River and down here. And right along here you can see that there's something going on. And if you follow the river channel, it kind of looks like the river takes a really sharp left. If you look even more closely, you can actually maybe find that old riverbed. It used to come somewhere into town here. I'm not quite sure where, but talking with a couple of historical folks up there, the river channel actually came through the center of town and head up down on the South River a little bit further down. But at some point they came in and they filled it in and try to adjust the river left. If you walk up in the woods, you can actually see one of those examples of those high berms. This area has failed repetitively. Obviously, being just upstream of the Route 116 bridge is a concern. I was actually out there this past summer, just in July, where they just completed the most recent restoration of this brook. I think this is a geocell type of technique. I was actually out there with a fluviogeomorphologist who studies these things. And he wasn't involved in the design of this, but there's a couple things that we were concerned with. One of them is that, again, thinking about where the river channel is coming from, you're basically having the river hit this wall. And it is pretty vertical here. A couple of the projects that I've been involved with, which have used similar bioengineering techniques, we actually try to step the bank back instead of having these straight vertical walls. But this is what the site looked like after our meeting. Lasted less than a couple of months. At this point, I think the town has just dumped rock. The whole South River, or a good portion of the South River, is actually now under a fluviogeomorphic study, trying to look at areas where you can actually hopefully alleviate maybe some of the pressure here. Maybe finding areas where you can find that, regain that access back to the floodplains, or remove maybe some of those old berms. It's actually something that they've been doing a lot in Vermont, and protecting those floodplain corridors and going in and finding these spots where you can actually have these relief valves so that it can protect downstream infrastructure. Another area that we saw, this is up in, I believe, probably Buckland, or maybe just a little bit further up on Pleasant Brook. As I mentioned, we saw some aggregation, some channel realignment, but we also saw some degradation. This is the river channel cutting down. And I think, as Bob had mentioned during his presentation, you have the road that follows pretty closely along the brook there. And where, again, if the river can't lose its energy by spreading out across the floodplain, it's going to pull the materials. It's taking the energy from down below and moving the materials down below. And often as it degrades, what then happens is the structures that we've put in here to try to protect our roadways will often get undercut. Bank hardening has been something we've used for many years, and it's come in various forms. This is an example of a retaining wall up on the Swift River up in Cummington. This is during Tropical Storm Irene. It's kind of hard to make out, but right there on the corner is where these next set of photos were taken after the storm. This is obviously out on the outside bend, taking a lot of that erosional pressure. And you can see that the NRCS had been in there, I think, in the 80s or 90s, and installed these gabion baskets. And I don't know if everybody knows what a gabion basket is, but it's basically a wire mesh basket with rock fill. And again, they often have designed these to be stacked vertically. And what happened is, and I've seen this in other floods, is the river gets up behind these baskets and just peels them off the bank, and they start slumping. You can see this bottom one's looking upstream. You can see that the gabions are starting to slump in. So usually, if you keep hardening your banks, you're just pushing that pressure downstream. And if you keep hardening it, it's just transferring the problems downstream. We also saw impacts at extreme pinch points. This is a good example here. This is the Deerfield River again, up at the Zor Gap area. As you can see, you have the railroad on one side. You have the Zor Road going off this way on the other side. And basically, again, there's no access here for floodplain access. And the river just scoured out the material, and it resulted in the road failure. Another example, I think some of you are familiar with, is this is the Green River Water Supply Dam on Green River and Greenfield. This is their covered bridge. And you can see what happens is if the river is confined or has an area where it can't adjust, it'll find a way around. And this is what happened. It failed on the river left embankment there. So we've heard a lot of mentioning about undersized culverts, and one of the reasons I'm here today is to talk about some of the work that I've done with our volunteers here in Massachusetts, including Jane and some other folks out in Housatonic, where we've gone out and actually assessed crossings. And typically, our volunteers have been concerned about fish passage, so we're often looking for things that inhibit fish passage. What's interesting is a lot of things that indicate problems for fish passage are also indicating problems for culverts being undersized. So for example, here, this is the upstream end of this culvert. And you can see that there's this deposition of material. Basically what's happening there is that at higher flows, the water's ponding up behind this culvert, it's losing its energy, and it's dropping out that material, which is also ultimately reducing the capacity of this culvert to pass the higher flows. So this was surveyed back in October 2005. Ironically, a week later it washed out. Of course, I don't have any photos of that washout. But it got replaced with this here. And it's actually a place I've taken my volunteers back to do training on. And I replaced it with 3 round plastic pipes you can see here. And we still found this to be a moderate barrier for fish passage, and for similar reasons. Another issue is that with the 2 culverts side by side, it's not allowing the river to pass not only the substrate that it's carrying, but also any woody habitat or other debris that it may be carrying, that it can easily get clogged up. Well, sure enough, during that rain, it got washed out again. And I think for a lot of the reasons that Bob described earlier about sort of not having the expertise within your community or the limitations of the funding sources, the next slide I'm about to show you is basically what we often see happen. And I want to get your sense on whether you think this is going to be a solution. So this was replaced with 2 5-foot metal corrugated culverts. I'll put money on this that this isn't going to last for very long. If the other ones had failed within a 6-year time frame, I think that these are highly likely that they'll fail. So I also wanted to mention, as part of the work that we're doing, looking at fish passage, there's been a working group here in Massachusetts developing standards. And although the standards are primarily focused on facilitating fish and wildlife passage or crossings, as I mentioned, some of these things get addressed by allowing the movement of these materials through the crossing. But they can't be standalone. You do have to do some of the hydraulic and hydrologic calculations that Pat was mentioning to take a look at these things. But we do have some examples where when we followed these standards, that these types of culverts have survived these storms better. And there's actually 2 sets. Basically, the general standards And then the optimum standards. Optimum standards are usually in areas where we have really critical ecological infrastructure. So it's basically a wildlife passage or fish passage for endangered species or species of special concern. But generally, the general standards are what we're targeting for. And they typically are, again, an open span. And if there's a culvert that it's embedded to provide some of the natural substrates within the crossing. These have actually been incorporated, these or similar standards have been incorporated into some of the permits, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Programmatic General Permit, the Massachusetts 401 Water Quality Certification, and further, the Wetlands Protection Act requires that the crossings maintain a carrying capacity of the channel. There is some regulatory reform. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with, but DEP has been looking at some of the regulations and looking at streamlining some of the regulations. And one of the things that they're actually looking at is coming out with a general permit that would look at, if you met these types of standards, you'll be able to facilitate a much quicker permit process. Those aren't out yet, but they should be out for public comment probably in the next couple months. So keep your eyes out for those. Again, this is an example I like because it shows the overlap of public health and safety as well as sort of our ecological infrastructure. This is on Bronson Brook in Worthington, Mass. It's a double box culvert. And if you look up through the culvert here, you can actually see what I've been talking about with the movement of the woody debris and material. This got overtopped or clogged up and overtopped on a couple occasions. And after the storm in 2003, the town had enough. And it happened to be one of a great cold water habitats for brook trout and Atlantic salmon. So my division, as well as several other conservation groups in this region, got together with the town and provided funding to replace this crossing. And this is just a photo of the brook just downstream. This is the crossing downstream taken during Tropical Storm Irene. And you can see the water level is actually a little bit higher based on this water line you see in the background. You can see that the stream was cranking pretty good that day. This is the culvert after, or the one on the left is the culvert after the storm. The culvert freely passed the water, freely passed the woody debris. You can actually see this is just after we had replaced the culvert. A tree had naturally fallen, a channel spanning tree. This tree was gone. I was amazed when I got up there, and I'm looking for this huge tree. The water was capable enough to carry this tree and easily pass it through the culvert. So again, when you think about some of the things that are going on from a river perspective, and you keep that in your mind as you're proceeding with design and planning, I think that it really helps you find ways to work with the river, both from a public health and safety perspective, but also from protecting some of the ecological benefits. And we're not the only ones that are seeing this. The Forest Service up in Vermont had similar culverts. And I'm not going to talk too much about these, but they're basically having similar findings. And they're actually going through now and doing assessments both on the culverts that survived, that met a lot of these standards, and some of the traditional culverts that failed. And they're looking at both the economic impacts to the communities, so the ones that remained open versus the ones that were failed, as well as some of the adjustments to engineering calculations and things. Again, this is just another example. Just some take-home messages. As Pat was mentioning, using up-to-date data for sizing culverts and locating your infrastructure, I think, is really important. Wherever you can, increase the infiltration, using some of those PMPs and stormwater techniques. And keeping in mind the river when you're going to design. Minimize the stream bank hardening, and where you can, protecting the floodplain development. I also just wanted to mention, I was just at the Fish Passage Conference happening up at UMass, and I grabbed a couple of documents that they put together from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They actually deployed teams up in Vermont which provided engineering expertise to communities. It's something that they're hoping to provide in the future. And they also have a lot of great programs that we've worked with to actually work on some of these culvert replacements. So if you're interested, feel free to grab a couple of these as well. I also have a poster that we're actually in the process of updating, but I brought a few copies today that talks about the standards and gives you some examples of some of the problems that we often see at the culverts. We're all interested.
Thank you, Carrie. And I know that we've run a little bit past our time and that some of you have other parts of the program to get to. But I think that so I'm going to forego Q&A because of that, so I want to respect all of your time. However, if any of you do have questions or would like to speak with Carrie or any of the other speakers about other resources available to your communities to address the issues you're concerned about, you can stay and add to that. Okay, thank you.